The United States can invade almost any country in the world, destroy entire economies, and remove governments, but there is one country it cannot touch: Mexico. And the reason is not military strength, it is not diplomacy, it is oil. What Claudia Sheinbaum has just done this week will change the next 50 years of relations between both countries, and Washington is in panic. Today, I am going to reveal the oil strategy that Mexico secretly prepared over the last 4 years and explain why the United States has no real way to stop it. Welcome. I am Richard Wolff, an economist and professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts. For more than 40 years, I have studied economic relations between the United States and Latin America. I have analyzed crises, documented interventions, and watched how U.S. economic imperialism has shaped the fate of entire nations. But what is happening right now in January 2026 has no precedent. Mexico is playing a game that no one in Washington expected, and Mexico is holding all the winning cards. Let me begin by explaining something very few people truly understand. Oil is not just fuel. Oil is power. Oil is sovereignty. Oil is the difference between being an independent nation and being an economic colony. Mexico understood this almost 90 years ago when Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized the oil industry in 1938. That decision, made by a brave president under international threats, defined the future of the country. And now, almost a century later, Claudia Sheinbaum is writing the next chapter of that same story. What I'm going to tell you today will not be heard in traditional media. You will not read it in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, because this information directly affects the interests of major U.S. oil corporations. It affects the plans of the Trump administration. It affects the future of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. But you deserve to know, because this will change your lives whether you like it or not. 3 weeks ago, in December 2025, the Mexican government quietly announced a series of changes to the hydrocarbons law. The media described it as a technical adjustment, a small modification. But when I reviewed the documents and studied the economic consequences, I realized we were witnessing a historic shift. Mexico was not simply adjusting its oil policy. Mexico was declaring its energy independence from the United States, and it was doing so in a way that Washington cannot legally challenge. You need to understand the background. For decades, the United States tried to convince Mexico to open its oil sector to foreign investment. They tried with Carlos Salinas, they tried with Vicente Fox, they tried with Felipe Calderón, and finally, in 2013, under Enrique Peña Nieto, they succeeded. That energy reform opened the doors to major U.S. oil companies like Chevron, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips. They all entered Mexico promising to invest billions of dollars. But what they truly wanted was something far more valuable: control over Mexico's oil reserves. This is where the story becomes truly interesting. When Andrés Manuel López Obrador came to power in 2018, he began reversing that reform. Slowly, without loud announcements, he strengthened Pemex, canceled unfavorable contracts, and limited concessions to foreign companies. Washington protested. Oil companies threatened lawsuits. But López Obrador did not back down. And when Claudia Sheinbaum took office in October 2024, many believed she would soften the direction. They were completely wrong. What Sheinbaum did last December was permanently shut the door that Peña Nieto had opened. The new reforms established that 80% of Mexican oil production must be processed by Pemex or by companies with majority state ownership. This means that U.S. corporations that invested billions of dollars now face a harsh reality. Either they accept being minority partners of the Mexican state, or they leave with nothing. And there is nothing they can do to stop it. Let me explain why this is so important. Mexico produces about 1.8 million barrels of oil per day. It is not the largest producer in the world, but it has something very few countries possess: geographic proximity to the United States and direct access to the Gulf of Mexico. Refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi depend on Mexican oil to operate. Without that supply, gasoline prices in the southern United States would surge within weeks. But that is not all. What I uncovered in my research goes far beyond current production. Mexico has proven oil reserves of more than 6 billion barrels. And according to geological reports that the government has kept quiet, potential deepwater reserves in the Gulf could exceed 20 billion barrels. We are talking about one of the largest oil discoveries in recent decades, and Sheinbaum has just ensured that this oil remains under Mexican control. Now, I want you to understand Washington's reaction. Donald Trump, who began his second term just weeks ago, is furious. During his campaign, he promised that the United States would dominate energy production across the hemisphere. He promised to force Mexico to open its natural resources to U.S. companies. He promised tariffs, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. But when his advisors explained the real situation, he realized he has no good options. Let me tell you what a source close to the State Department revealed to me. In a National Security Council meeting held 2 weeks ago, Trump's advisors presented an analysis of possible responses to Mexico's reforms. The first option was to impose 25% tariffs on Mexican goods. The problem is that this would raise prices for cars, appliances, and food in the United States exactly when inflation is already hurting Trump's voters. The second option was to block refined gasoline exports to Mexico. But Mexico anticipated this move. The Dos Bocas refinery, inaugurated by López Obrador and expanded under Sheinbaum, has sharply reduced Mexico's dependence on imported gasoline. The third option was to apply pressure through the USMCA trade agreement. But lawyers at the Department of Commerce concluded that Mexico's reforms do not violate any clause of the treaty. Mexico has the sovereign right to define its own energy policy. Stay with me, because what comes next is even more revealing. Trump ordered his team to find any way to pressure Sheinbaum, any weak point, any vulnerability. The answer he received left him silent. Mexico holds a card that the United States cannot match: the threat of selling its oil to China. Let me explain how this works. Currently, most Mexican oil is exported to the United States. It makes sense. The distance is short, shipping routes already exist, pipelines are in place, and long-term contracts are active. But China has been courting Mexico for years. They offer better prices, investment in infrastructure, access to refining technology, and most importantly, a relationship without the political conditions that the United States always imposes. What my sources confirmed is that in November 2025, just 1 month before the reforms, a Chinese delegation visited Mexico City. It was not an official visit. There were no press releases. But executives from Sinopec, China's largest oil company, met with officials from Mexico's Ministry of Energy. They discussed the possibility of building a pipeline from oil fields in southeastern Mexico to the port of Salina Cruz on the Pacific coast. From there, oil could be shipped directly to China on tanker ships. The project would cost around $15 billion, and China offered to finance 80% of it. Imagine the consequences. If Mexico redirects even 30% of its oil exports to China, the United States would face a supply crisis. Gulf Coast refineries would be forced to buy oil from more distant and more expensive markets. Gasoline prices would rise. The U.S. petrochemical industry would lose competitiveness, and the geopolitical message would be devastating. The American petrochemical industry would lose competitiveness. And most importantly, the geopolitical message would be devastating. A traditional ally of the United States, right on its southern border, choosing China as a strategic partner. Now I want to explain something the media is not talking about. This is not just a trade dispute. This is a fight over the future of the global economic order. For more than 70 years, the United States has kept its global dominance thanks to two main pillars. One is control of the international financial system through the dollar. The other is control of the oil market through alliances with producing countries. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Emirates all sold their oil in dollars, and they all invested their profits in U.S. Treasury bonds. This system, known as the petrodollar, is the foundation of Washington's economic power. But that system is starting to crack. Russia already sells its oil in rubles and yuan. Saudi Arabia has started negotiating oil sales in other currencies. And now Mexico, a country that shares more than 3,000 kilometers of border with the United States, is considering moving away from the dollar system in its oil transactions. This is not a theory. This is what is being discussed right now in the halls of power in Mexico City as I speak. Let me tell you about a conversation that happened just 10 days ago. Sheinbaum received a phone call from Trump's Secretary of State. The call lasted 40 minutes. According to what I was told, the tone was polite but tense. The U.S. official expressed concern about Mexico's energy reforms. He suggested that Mexico was sending the wrong signals to investors. He hinted that there could be consequences. Sheinbaum listened calmly and then responded with a sentence that perfectly summarizes Mexico's new position. She said, "Mexico is a sovereign country. Our natural resources belong to the Mexican people, and we decide how to manage them." That simple sentence carries decades of historical resentment. And here I need to pause and explain the broader context, because what is happening now cannot be understood without knowing the history of how the United States has treated Mexico for almost 200 years. In 1848, the United States took more than 2,400,000 square kilometers of territory from Mexico. California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. More than half of what Mexico was became U.S. territory. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed after a war of aggression, gave the United States land that today is worth trillions of dollars. California alone has a GDP larger than most countries in the world. Texas is an energy powerhouse. Arizona has strategic minerals, and Mexico received compensation of just $15 million. An insult. This historical loss has not been forgotten. Every Mexican learns it in school. Every Mexican knows that cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Antonio, and Phoenix were founded by Mexicans. They know the U.S. Southwest has Spanish names because it was Mexican land. They know that part of California's wealth was built on land that belonged to Mexican families. This historical memory fuels the nationalism that now supports Sheinbaum's policies. When she defends Mexican oil, she is not only protecting an economic resource, she is reclaiming sovereignty that the United States has tried to weaken for generations. But the story does not end in 1848. During the 20th century, the United States repeatedly intervened in Mexican affairs. It supported coups, pressured Mexico to open its economy, and imposed conditions through the IMF and the World Bank. And oil was always at the center of these conflicts. When Cardenas nationalized oil in 1938, U.S. and British oil companies demanded a military invasion. Roosevelt refused, but he imposed an economic boycott that lasted for years. What Sheinbaum understands, and what Trump seems not to understand, is that Mexico learned from that history. It is no longer the weak and dependent country the United States could easily intimidate. Mexico's economy is now among the largest in the world. It is the top trading partner of the United States above China and Canada. Millions of U.S. jobs depend on trade with Mexico. Supply chains in the automotive, electronics, and aerospace industries cross the border dozens of times before a product reaches the final consumer. Mexico has more bargaining power than ever before, and this is where oil becomes the ultimate weapon. Let me explain the numbers. The United States consumes about 20 million barrels of oil per day. It produces around 13 million. That leaves a gap of about 7 million barrels that must be imported. Of those, roughly 600,000 barrels come from Mexico. That may not sound like much, but those 600,000 barrels are critical for Gulf Coast refineries, which are specifically designed to process the heavy crude that Mexico exports. If Mexico decided to cut its exports to the United States by 50%, Texas refineries would face an immediate crisis. They could not simply replace Mexican crude with oil from somewhere else. They would need to be reconfigured, a process that takes months and costs billions of dollars. In the meantime, gasoline prices in the southern United States would surge. And in a country where gas prices are a highly sensitive political issue, that would be devastating for any government. Now I want to reveal something I found in leaked documents from the U.S. Department of Energy. In October 2025, 1 month before the U.S. elections, government analysts prepared a classified report on America's energy vulnerability to Mexico. The report concluded that a disruption of Mexican oil supply would cause economic losses between $80 and $120 billion in the first year alone. It urgently recommended maintaining friendly relations with Mexico and avoiding confrontations that could trigger energy retaliation. That report reached Trump's desk, and it is one of the reasons why, despite his aggressive rhetoric, he has not taken concrete action against Mexico. He knows he cannot win this fight. He knows Mexico holds strong cards, and he knows any escalation could backfire badly. But the story of Mexican oil does not end with defending against the United States. Let me tell you about the expansion plans Sheinbaum has set in motion, because Mexico is not just protecting what it has, it is aiming to grow aggressively. In the last 3 months of 2025, Pemex announced investments of more than $30 billion over the next 5 years. The goal is to increase production from 1.8 million barrels per day to 2.5 million by 2030. This will be achieved through exploration of new deep water fields, modernization of existing facilities, and the use of advanced enhanced recovery technology. What few people know is where that technology comes from. Not from the United States, not from Europe, from China and Russia. Last November, Pemex signed an agreement with the Russian company Rosneft to share deep water drilling technology. This is the same type of technology U.S. companies denied Mexico for years, tying it to unacceptable political and economic concessions. Russia imposed no such conditions. It simply offered a favorable commercial deal. This agreement went almost unnoticed in international media, but it caused alarm in the Pentagon. Russian technology operating in the Gulf of Mexico, just miles from U.S. shores, represents a major geopolitical shift. It shows that Mexico is willing to seek alternative partners when the United States does not offer fair terms. Now, let me explain how this affects ordinary people, because I know many of you are asking, this all sounds big and important, but how does it affect me? The answer is directly and deeply. If you live in the United States, especially in the South, the price you pay for gasoline is partly determined by Mexican oil. If that supply is reduced or becomes more expensive, you will pay more at the pump. Your transportation costs will rise. The goods you buy, which arrive on trucks that run on diesel, will also become more expensive. And that impact will be felt in everyday life, not in theory, but in real money coming out of people's pockets. They will cost more. Inflation, which is already hitting the wallets of millions of families, will get worse. If you live in Mexico, the effects are different, but just as important. A stronger Pemex means more jobs in the energy sector. It means oil income can be used to fund social programs, infrastructure, and education. It means Mexico can negotiate from a position of strength with any country in the world. Energy sovereignty is not an abstract idea. It is the difference between a country that decides its own future and a country that depends on the decisions of others. Now, I want to talk about something almost no one mentions, the environmental impact. I know it may sound contradictory that a progressive economist like me speaks positively about expanding oil production. Let me explain my view. The world must move toward clean energy. That is undeniable. Climate change is real and its effects are destructive. But this transition will take decades, not just a few years. And during those decades, oil will continue to be essential for the global economy. The real question is not whether oil will be extracted, but who will extract it and who will benefit from it. When an American corporation like ExxonMobil extracts oil in a developing country, the profits flow to shareholders in New York and executives in Houston. When the Mexican state controls extraction, those profits can be reinvested inside the country in hospitals, schools, pensions for workers, and in the energy transition that will eventually replace oil. This is the core difference between the neoliberal model defended by Trump and the sovereignty-based model that Sheinbaum is putting into action. In addition, Sheinbaum, who has a scientific background and experience in environmental issues, has included major investments in solar and wind energy in her oil plans. The idea is to use oil profits to finance the renewable energy infrastructure Mexico will need in the coming decades. It is a smart strategy, using a limited resource today while preparing for the future. But let's return to the confrontation with the United States, because this is where tensions are reaching dangerous levels. Let me tell you what is happening right now in Washington. Last week, a group of Republican senators introduced a bill they call the Western Hemisphere Energy Security Act. The name sounds harmless, but the content is aggressive. The law would allow the president to impose sanctions on any country in the hemisphere that limits access for U.S. companies to its energy resources. It specifically mentions the right of the United States to protect its strategic interests against nationalizations or trade restrictions. The bill is clearly aimed at Mexico, even though it does not mention it by name. If approved, it would give Trump legal tools to economically pressure Sheinbaum. He could freeze Mexican government assets in U.S. banks. He could block the sale of technology to Pemex. He could even restrict remittances that millions of Mexicans send to their families. This is where the situation becomes truly dangerous, because Mexico would not remain passive. It already has a response prepared that no one in Washington wants to seriously consider: the possibility of restricting the flow of Mexican workers to the United States. Let me explain why this would be disastrous for the U.S. economy. There are about 11 million Mexicans working in the United States, most of them in essential sectors: agriculture, construction, food processing, healthcare. Without these workers, crops would rot in the fields, construction projects would stop, restaurants would shut down, and nursing homes would have no one to care for residents. A study by the Migration Policy Institute estimated that if all undocumented workers disappeared from the U.S. economy, GDP would fall by more than $5 trillion over 10 years. That would mean a long and painful recession. Mexico has significant influence over these migration flows, not directly over undocumented workers, but over temporary worker programs and over the decisions of thousands of Mexicans each year who choose whether to cross the border or stay home. What I am describing is not fiction. These are real scenarios being discussed in closed meetings by national security analysts. This is the geopolitical chessboard where Mexico and the United States are moving their pieces, and oil is the queen on that board. Now, I want to take you to something I discovered just a few days ago that has not yet been reported by any media outlet. It involves Mexico's relationship with the BRICS countries, the group that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and that has recently expanded to include new members. Mexico has been closely watching the rise of this bloc. During the López Obrador administration, there were quiet conversations about possible participation. Sheinbaum has accelerated those talks. Last December, a Mexican delegation traveled to Kazan, Russia, where the latest BRICS summit was held. Officially, Mexico attended as an observer, but my sources confirm that there were bilateral meetings with officials from all member countries. What was discussed in those meetings has huge implications for the oil market. The BRICS countries are developing a payment system outside of SWIFT, which is dominated by the United States. They are creating ways to trade in their own currencies without using the dollar, and they are inviting oil-producing countries to join this new system. If Mexico were to sell even a small portion of its oil in yuan or in a new BRICS currency, it would be both a symbolic and practical blow to the petrodollar system. Other Latin American nations could follow. Venezuela already does this, but Venezuela is isolated and under sanctions. Mexico is different. Mexico is a major trade partner of the United States, a respected country in international forums, and a stable economy. If Mexico takes this step, it opens the door for others to do the same. Let me share an anecdote that perfectly shows the current tension. 2 weeks ago, during a press conference at the National Palace, an American journalist asked Sheinbaum if Mexico was considering moving away from the United States and closer to China. The president smiled and calmly replied, "Mexico is a friend to all countries. We have no enemies, but we also have no masters. We do business with those who offer us the best conditions." That answer was broadcast live. In Washington, analysts saw it as a clear warning. Mexico is willing to diversify its alliances if the United States continues to treat it as a subordinate country. The era of submission is over, and oil is the tool of this new independence. Now I want to explain the technological side of this battle, because control of oil is not just about who owns it underground, but who has the technical ability to extract it, refine it, and transport it. For decades, Mexico depended on U.S. technology for its oil industry. Drilling platforms, control systems, refining equipment, everything came from the north. That dependence was another form of control. If Mexico did something Washington disliked, it was enough to delay spare parts or deny the sale of new equipment. But this is changing. Over the past 3 years, Mexico has signed technology transfer agreements with companies from China, South Korea, Norway, and Russia. It is building its own capabilities in key areas. The Dos Bocas refinery, which entered full operation last year, was built with mixed technology, reducing dependence on any single supplier. Pemex has also created a research and development program that is training the next generation of Mexican oil engineers. What this means is that technological blackmail no longer works. If the United States tried to block technology sales to Mexico, as it has done with other countries, Mexico has alternatives. They are not perfect, but they are sufficient. And every year, those alternatives become stronger. Now, let me address something I know many of you are thinking about: remittances. Mexicans living in the United States send more than $60 billion a year to their families. That is an enormous amount, equal to nearly 5% of Mexico's GDP. Some argue that this dependence limits Mexico's ability to confront the United States. If Washington blocked remittances, millions of Mexican families would suffer. But there is something that superficial analysts fail to understand. Remittances flow from individuals to individuals. They are not a centralized system that can be easily controlled or shut down overnight.